The skills and credentials you need for the career you want are within reach at University of Maryland Global Campus. An accredited state university, UMGC offers online courses, personalized advising, lifetime career services, and more. Visit umgc.edu/podcast.
Care has the power to bring kindness where it's needed. It brings out the best in every one of us. It doesn't just see people. It takes time to understand them. It puts the needs of others ahead of its own. And when you start with care, you end up with a very different kind of bank. Truist. Truist Bank, member FDIC.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Almost World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. 3. Welcome to Almost World Podcast. This is Elmo, and I'm with my friend Günter.
Yeah, hello. So my name is Günter Bechly. I'm a German paleontologist. I currently work as a senior fellow for Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is a think tank that is spearheading the intelligent design movement. I'm also working as a research scientist for Biologic Institute in Redmond, United States. But I'm seated in Austria, so I work via the internet. My profession is paleontologist, scientist. I studied at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And from 1999 till 2016, I worked as a curator for amber and fossil insects at the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart. And at this museum, I organized an exhibition for the Darwin year in 2009. And in the course of this exhibition, I came into contact with intelligent design literature because we wanted to show this issue of Darwin critics. And of course, I wanted to refute them. And I came into contact with the arguments, and to my surprise, I found many of the arguments quite cogent and valid. And so in the course of several years, I became a critic of the Darwinian theory of unguided evolution myself, and became an intelligent design proponent. And therefore, in 2016, I left the museum and now work for Discovery Institute.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. And yeah, but I guess when it comes to what you generally believe, I would love to ask you about your, the story of how you became a theist. I think because it's
probably very different from other people, because most people come to theism because their parents believed in some theistic religion, in Christianity or Islam or whatever, and then they were educated in some kind of religious belief system. That's not the case, not the case at all in my case. So I grew up in a secular home, never went to church, was not baptized, and was not interested in religion. For most of my life, was not interested even in philosophy. So I was mostly interested in natural sciences and the so-called hard facts that you can see. And then quite late in my life, I developed an interest in philosophy via an interest in, on a popular science level, interest in modern physics. And there I realized that certain developments in modern physics, if it is quantum mechanics or interpretations of relativity theory or modern cosmology with this whole subject of emergent space-time, that these have philosophical implications. And then I started to delve into issues like the philosophy of time and the philosophy of mind. And I soon discovered that my previous worldview of materialism couldn't explain many phenomena like the hard problem of consciousness. And so I became relatively soon a non-materialist, but not a theist. So I explored different philosophical, metaphysical systems like idealism and integral philosophy, Eastern systems of thought, and especially Whiteheadian process philosophy. And sooner or later, in each case, I discovered inconsistencies in these worldviews as well. And then I looked into classical theism, and there, to my surprise, I discovered that this explains most of the phenomena that I considered as crucial best. And so I became a theist. But this happened even after my conversion, in a way, from Darwinism to intelligent design theory. I was first doubting Darwinism for scientific reasons, and became convinced of intelligent design. And only later I discovered theism. And then, of course, I had, let's say, a different explanation. Who could be the designer and what could be behind the teleology in nature, not theology, but teleology in nature. And as soon as you are a theist, then of course you look at the different religions and look which religion is best supported by the empirical evidence as well. And I'm a scientist. I don't want to believe something just because it's said so or it's written in the Bible or whatever. I only believe stuff if the empirical evidence suggests that it's the best explanation. And so I looked at the different religions in Judaism and Islam and Christianity, theistic religions, and discovered that Christianity is best supported by the historical evidence and by other arguments as well. And therefore, relatively late, many years after I became an intelligent design proponent and then a theist, I finally became a Christian theist.
Okay, well, I guess like listening to your story, I think that you really started with just doubting Darwinism, right? You being this paleontologist. I think that's where your journey towards theism started. Is that would that would
not really? As I said, the original start was this interest in modern physics and the realization that phenomena like if you look at time, for example, and you see that the Minkowski space-time interpretation of general and special relativity doesn't allow for any kind of real flow of time and of real becoming. It's more or less an illusion of consciousness being inside of space-time. Then, of course, you realize that this has certain philosophical implications. And these consideration, what is the nature of causality? Where do the laws of nature come from? What is the nature of consciousness? That was at the very beginning of my journey. And then for many years, I was a non-materialist, but non-theist as well. So I didn't believe in God, but I didn't believe in materialism either, and had different ways of trying to make sense of this. But then I discovered the problems of the theory of evolution and the criticisms of Darwinism. And then, of course, there was another, let's say, stone in this mosaic of different evidences that make this kind of cumulative case for theism. And then ultimately I came to realize that theism is the best explanation for everything, why there is anything rather than nothing, and how is the relationship between these mathematical laws of nature and physical reality to be explained, what Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the natural sciences. And so I discovered ultimately theism makes sense. Totally against my will, actually. I was not looking for theism, and I never liked Christianity, so it was very much not confirmation bias. Many people come to a belief system because they have this kind of confirmation bias, and they look for evidence that supports what they want to believe. But I didn't want to believe in Christianity. I didn't like it. I thought Christians are mostly cowards that are afraid of dying. And that makes me quite confident that my journey led me to ultimate the true position, because it was not what I was looking for, and I was convinced against my predispositions that this is the correct point.
Okay, well, I want to look at like how you, I guess, your thought process on initially, because you said it's more when you looked at the metaphysics, right, and all the studies and the generally the present theories, I guess, that and how academics are tackling them. Can you, I guess, like school me into how where you started and what your conclusion was, specifically, I guess, in terms of time, and then the hard problem of consciousness.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So one real moment where it clicked for me that something is a problem concerning the philosophy of time was when I realized that the overwhelming evidence from the physical sciences point to a view of time that is called eternalism, or the B theory of time. So kind of view the time doesn't flow, the past and future all exist on per se, and the present is more or less an indexical term like here. So I realized this has implications for my biological views, because before I really thought about this, I had this simple belief, let's say in terms of 19th century worldview, that time is flowing, that you have this causality, and that this causality explains how things come about. And if I look at my own field in the theory of evolution, it was, well, evolution, this Darwinian process, explains how simple precursors of life, the first cell, developed into all this diversity. But when I realized that we have this kind of block universe, and that the future and the present and the past all exist in this four-dimensional block, then I realized, well, this whole theory doesn't explain really why this diversity of life is there, because these are just different geometrical points in this four-dimensional block. One point is the origin of the universe, and one point is the origin of life, and somewhere else in this four-dimensional block is, let's say, the origin of dinosaurs, and later the origin of man, and so on. But it's all there, so there is no real explanation why this diversity of life really exists per se, and because this process of Darwinian evolution is more or less an illusion that's happening within space-time, but all the diversity exists at different points in space-time per se. And so that really showed me, well, then we really need an explanation. Where does this structure of space-time and this rich diversity that we find in space-time, where does it come from? And then I, of course, encountered this fundamental problem of ontology and of metaphysics that was formulated by Leibniz, I think, first, which is, why is there anything rather than nothing? And then, of course, you soon reach points where you see, well, that certainly cannot be explained with materialism, because nature.
Yeah, but before that, like, can you talk about like what you mean by diversity in space-time and relating to?
Yeah, sure. So if we look, if you imagine, let's say, this four-dimensional space-time like a loaf of bread, you transform 4 dimensions into 3 dimensions, and you imagine this 4-dimensional space-time universe from the Big Bang till eternity would be a 3-dimensional loaf of bread. Then the let's say, if you, oops, sorry. Then cutting this loaf of bread would give a plane of the present, and you can cut this loaf of bread in different angles. That would be the relativity of the plane of the present. But everything that is in this loaf of bread, in this 4-dimensional space-time, the whole history of life is just there. If you look from outside, you look at, let's say, one end of the loaf of bread is the origin of the universe, and somewhere in the middle is the origin of life. And then you look a little bit more on the other side, and there is more complex life, but it's all there. So what is happening inside of space-time doesn't really explain why this content of space-time is there, because the whole space-time is one large mathematical complex structure that exists in a way outside of time. And
I guess like
time is
generally
just
you
an
mean
illusion.
that like like where does everything come from? Because if space-time is if space-time is everything, then it doesn't really explain it coming from just nothing, right? When it, even if
Right. You have to explain, let's say, if you look inside, if you look from within space-time and you are inside of space-time, then processes of causality explain certain phenomena. But as soon as you realize that this space-time is not really happening, isn't it? There's not really a flow from cause to effect, then you need another explanation why this whole space-time universe exists. Not just why, let's say, the universe has a beginning and there has to be beginner or simplistic question like this, but where does this complete structure, this coherent mathematical object of four-dimensional space-time, where does it come from, and what explains its order? What Einstein also said is one of the most miraculous things of the universe is that we can understand it, and that it is understandable, and is having this simple mathematical order. It could be different, it could be chaotic, or it could have at different points very different mathematical structures, but it has this overall coherent, simple mathematical structure that allows us to understand the workings of the universe. And
well,
that is
I
something
guess like
that really puzzled me.
yeah, but generally, in a nutshell, what was the question that left? I guess like it was left in your mind when you looked at the problem of the B theory of time or other theories when it comes to time.
Several. It was not just one. It was not just one issue. It was several issues. So one issue is this issue of causality. That causality, which apparently explains stuff, only explains stuff, let's say, under an A theory of time, where there is a flow, a movement from cause to effect, and this is in a way annihilated by the B theory of time. Another issue, of course, is related to the questions of free will and morality, and if the future exists, especially exactly like the past, do we have free will? Do our actions matter? Are we really responsible for what we are doing? So these are other issues that played a role in this thinking process about the philosophy of time. So it was various issues that brought me on a kind of journey of looking into different worldviews. What could explain all these phenomena? What could best explain consciousness? What could best explain time? What could best explain causality? What could best explain why there is anything rather than nothing, and so on.
Okay, let's talk about the hard problem of consciousness, because then if you're a non-materialist, right? Like, and
Right.
and in your Facebook profile, you're a Neo-Platonist. Can
Yes.
you? Okay, so let's talk about the start of the journey in terms of exploring the hard problem of consciousness, and then like how it led you to being a Neo-Platonist.
Yes, so my journey started, of course, from this materialist point of view, and I was a fan of Daniel Dennett, and I read the books by Daniel Dennett. But even when I was still a materialist, or at least, let's say, searching, and was not yet convinced that materialism is false, I realized that some things that Daniel Dennett wrote in his books, like Consciousness Explained, really didn't have the ring of truth to me. So when he says that qualia are something that is an illusion, I immediately thought, well, illusion of whom? An illusion presupposes qualia and presupposes consciousness. Consciousness cannot be an illusion, because to have an illusion, you have to be conscious. So that was basically the starting point. And then I looked at different systems. So I looked at Eastern systems of non-dualism, where basically everything is derived from this kind of non-dual mind at the base as the ground of being. I then looked into different panpsychist views, especially Whiteheadian process philosophy, which has this kind of similarity to Leibnizian monadology, where you have these different actual occasions, these drops of experience that then correlate and cooperate with each other. And then I looked into idealism, objective idealism and subjective idealism. And I'm not even now totally settled in this. I'm more or less switching between classical theism and objective idealism in my general metaphysical worldview. But what was very clear for me after a very short time, after exploring this hard problem of consciousness, is that consciousness has to be, in a way, fundamental. And what currently convinces me most that consciousness is at the very ground of being and also at the ground of the universe is if you combine the most modern cosmology and most modern physics, which shows that space and time are not fundamental. And that is not some wacky fringe stuff, but is stuff that is said by people like Sean Carroll or Max Tegmark, or the most famous quantum physicists, and so mainstream view that space-time is emergent, and there is a growing consensus that is correlated to something that is called the holographic principle, that space-time is derived from something non-spatial, non-temporal, and that is strongly related to entanglement, quantum entanglement. So space-time is derived from entangled quantum information. And if you take this point and then another point, there is a much growing consensus in mainstream science, so not among philosophers of religion, but mainstream naturalistic scientists. If they look to explain consciousness, the currently most favored theory is so-called integrated information theory by a scientist called Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch. And this integrated information theory, which basically says that integrated information is consciousness, and even gives us a very rigorous mathematical definition and even a value, a number phi, which says how much consciousness does a system have. And if you combine these two things and you realize that mathematically it has been demonstrated that entangled information is the same as integrated information, this means space-time, and this means all space and time, all matter and energy, is based on entangled quantum information, is emergent from entangled quantum information, which is equivalent to integrated information, which is, if this currently favored theory of integrated information theory is correct, is corresponding to consciousness. So the space-time universe is emergent from consciousness. And this, I think, is a very new, it's not based on my own thoughts. There are different thinkers who have come to this conclusion in this whole movement currently of quantum idealism, that this is a new kind of proof for the existence of God. If you want to call this conscious ground of being God, you can call it however you want, but of course it's quite similar to what most people mean by God. Then this shows there's scientific evidence that the universe is based on consciousness rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to, I generally I am like a sort of a dualist, and I recognize that consciousness could actually be sort of metaphysically emergent, right? But can you talk about the scientific evidence to this? I've never really dived into this.
Yes, sure. So if we look at modern physics, and modern physics in this case means one thing, especially quantum mechanics, there have been many experiments that have shown that the naive view of local realism, which means the view that assumes that there is a physical reality that is independent from the observer, that is unique in a way, and that where no interactions can be faster than the speed of light. So that is local realism. That is what physics was based on before these discoveries. And then there were several discoveries. They started with a so-called inequality that was created by John Bell and was later tested by Alain Aspect from the University of Paris. And it has been tested experimentally several times. It's a so-called no-go theorem, which means it makes several assumptions and then asks, does the experimental evidence confirm or conflict with the assumptions, and is the equation violated or not? And all the experiments show that reality violates this no-go theorem, and that one of the assumptions, either that the outside reality is independent from the observer, or that it is unique, or that interactions are limited by the speed of light. One of them has to be limited. And this opened the way for several strange interpretations of quantum mechanics. If you give up the uniqueness of the world, then you arrive at this many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. If you give up the observer independence, you arrive at the idealistic interpretations of quantum mechanics. And if you give up the speed of light limit, then you arrive at these non-local interpretations like Bohmian mechanics. But then came other experiments, especially the experimental verification of the so-called Leggett and Leggett-Garg inequalities, and also the experiments by the research team of Anton Zeilinger, who is a famous quantum physicist from Austria. And all these experiments converge to the point that reality really doesn't exist and doesn't have a defined value unless it is observed. So there definitely seems to be a deep function for consciousness and for observation in the nature of physical reality or of physics. And the more research was coming from then from cosmology and from this question of what happens in black holes when the information that falls inside, is it gone? Is in a kind this preservation of information violated by black holes, or is it sometimes coming out? There was a long debate between Stephen Hawking and his critics about this issue. But ultimately, people settled to an explanation that is called the holographic principle. And the holographic principle is something very interesting. Usually you would think all the information that you could pack in a three-dimensional volume of space would be related to the volumes. So the more bigger a sphere is, the more bits of information you can pack inside. The bigger the hard drive is, the more information you have. But what the holographic principle showed, that is meanwhile also experimentally confirmed and universally accepted in modern physics, is that the information content of three-dimensional space is limited by the surface of the volume. So all the information content of a black hole is defined by its event horizon. And all the information content of the universe is defined by a kind of two-dimensional border around it. And the content inside is like a kind of holographic projection from this two-dimensional information on the outside of the universe. And this is something that is actually discussed by mainstream physicists, that we live in this kind of holographic reality. But what this also means is that we don't live in this kind of naive three-dimensional reality plus time. And what then came is in the search of quantum gravity, that all the different approaches to quantum gravity, if it is loop quantum gravity or string theory, came to this point where they realized space-time ultimately disappears if you look at the level of quantum gravity, and space-time emerges from non-space-time, from a non-spatial, non-temporal realm of quantum information. And that together, when you have all the evidence from quantum mechanics that shows that materialism and this naive realism is wrong, that conscious observation plays a role, and that matter is not something that is simply out there. And then this discovery that space-time is not fundamental, but is emergent from information. This laid the groundwork, the scientific evidence for this hypothesis then, that if you look at quantum information, what is information? Information presupposes a mind in which this information is seated. Information is not something that is floating out there like numbers floating in a kind of Platonic space. So that's the reason, by the way, why I'm a Neoplatonist idealist, because in let's say original Platonism, Plato supposed that there is this kind of realm of forms, of mathematics and geometry that is floating in nowhere, without mind, without space-time, and so on. I think this is incoherent. We know that information presupposes a mind. There is no information without a mind that has this information as content and processes this information. So I think if we take all these lines of evidence together, then the case for information and mind and consciousness at the ground of being is quite powerful and quite strong. And you mentioned dualism. I, of course, also explore dualism, and especially Cartesian dualism. I think the fundamental problem, and that's why I relatively soon gave up this as a reasonable possibility, is that Cartesian dualism, that you have these two different substances that are totally unrelated. One realm is mind and one realm is matter, and then somehow they interact. This is actually incoherent, and Descartes himself, he had this little crazy idea that it was one tiny gland in the brain where the mind, the soul, interacts with the body. But actually, every time you have an interaction, you get a continuity. You need some continuity between two realms for them to interact. So if they are totally separate, one realm mind, one realm matter, there you have automatically this interaction problem, which I think is ultimately fatal for Cartesian dualism. There is another version of dualism for which I'm more sympathetic, and which is one of my two favorite metaphysics. One is, as I said, is Neoplatonist idealism. The other would be classical theism combined with Thomism. And Thomism is this Aristotelian-based view that you have this combination of matter and form, hylomorphism, where the soul is the form of the body, and where you don't have this interaction problem because form and body are not two different substances. Only their combination, when the body, when prime matter is informed by a substantial form, then you get a substance. So it's only one substance that is made of these two ingredients that cannot exist apart from each other. And that would be a possibility, to have this kind of Aristotelian Thomist hylomorphic dualism. So I'm a little bit undecided between these two views. I think there are arguments for both sides. Currently, I'm a little bit more inclined towards the side of quantum idealism, but I would still be open for this other ontology of Aristotelian dualism.
Mm-hmm. Well, would you describe this, I guess, like this Neoplatonist idealism that you believe in to be some sort of dream state, right? That the reality is simply purely made of consciousness to its fundamental to the fundamental, to the most basic fundamental level. Would
Yes.
you describe it as that?
Yes, yeah. Ultimately, I would say matter is emergent from consciousness, not the other way around. Materialists would say consciousness emerges from matter or doesn't exist at all, like Dennis says. I think that ultimately matter is derived from mind and from consciousness. And of course, not in the simple way as let's say some of the new age movement that also love to use quantum mechanics to explain any kind of, if I may say it like this, bullshit, like telekinesis or quantum healing or all this nonsense. There you have this kind of notion you can make your own reality, and you just have to think of a Lamborghini and you get it, and you have to send wishes to
And
the
law of
universe
attraction and all of this pseudosciences.
Yeah, and that is not only pseudoscientific nonsense. That is really total
nonsense.
Total nonsense, without any philosophical coherence, without really scientific backing. So of course it is not our limited mind, our limited consciousness that is in a way dreaming up the universe. That would be rather solipsism, but it means that there is a fundamental mental matrix from which the more limited minds emerge, and the interaction of these different limited minds together make up this appearance of a physical reality. And there's another currently very much hyped researcher, that is Donald Hoffman, who has developed something that is called conscious realism. And what he also has this conscious, this assumption that consciousness is at the base of everything, and that it is the interaction of conscious agent that make up all physical laws, for example. And the interesting thing is that this could be a wacky idea of a crank of a crackpot. But the interesting thing is that he has a theorem, and that is always interesting. If a scientist has a mathematical methodology and a mathematical apparatus where he has a theorem and the theorem can be tested. And the interesting thing is that starting from the interaction of conscious agents with very simple rules, he could derive the whole formula mathematical apparatus of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And this is in a way interesting. And this also resonates with some strange findings. And these are findings that I would consider more controversial. I don't 100% buy into this, but I find it interesting. And these two findings are one from so-called, I don't know if it's called quantum psychology, but there is some research that found that you can simulate or formulate mental processes with the same mathematical apparatus that you have in quantum mechanics. And even in everyday understanding, if you have to choose and you have two options and you're not totally sure, you have in a way these kind of overlapping probabilities for which of the sides you would choose. This can be very well formulated with a kind of wave function. That's interesting. And the other interesting thing is if we look at the structure of complex nervous system of brains, let's say the human brain or the brain of an ape or of a dolphin, and we look at the largest structures of the universe and these kind of patterns that we have, if we look at the web of galaxy clusters and where just this year there was a publication that there seemed to be this kind of information highways between galaxy clusters, and they have a striking resemblance, and this has been published in mainstream peer-reviewed literature, this eerie resemblance of the megastructures of the universe with the neural structures of the brain. It could be total nonsense, but it's interesting. So I keep this in as one point of evidence in mind that could play a role in this worldview. It could turn out that it's complete rubbish. We will see.
Well, I guess like the next question is, because when you're looking at the metaphysics here, and you analyze the theories on time, and now you analyze the theories on the problem of consciousness, right? So how does all of this lead you to classical theism, or at least being a theist?
Yes. So if you look at the different options, and especially, let's say, the question, why is there anything rather than nothing, and why is there this space-time reality, then of course you should find, I would almost say, you should find these cosmological arguments that say, well, if all of space-time reality has an explanation at all, if it doesn't have an explanation, then it's like giving up, then you're not longer looking for scientific explanations. But if there is an explanation, then this explanation has to be outside of space and time. So it must be a spaceless and timeless explanation. But how can a spaceless and timeless realm give rise to this spatiotemporal realm, and how can a necessarily existing realm that was never created, and if it is atemporal, it never had a beginning because it's not in time, so it was uncreated, how can this be the origin of something, of a contingent reality that was in a way created? If it was by a unconscious process or by a conscious process, doesn't play a role in the first place now. So how can this be? And if it would be an unconscious kind of natural law-like process of emergence, then if the cause is eternal, then the effect should be eternal as well. But our universe is not eternal. And we have good reason to think that even if there is a multiverse, then the multiverse is not eternal either. And there are different things that play a role here, like the Good-Vilenking theorem that show that the universe and potential multiverse that we can observe, of course we cannot observe the multiverse, but the part of the multiverse, if it exists, that we can observe, what we empirically find there with this expansion, overall expansion, is incompatible with a past infinite existence. So we have a universe or multiverse that has a kind of past space-time boundary. And this can only be explained by an eternal atemporal cause if this cause has something like free will. And that is something, of course, that requires a mind and a consciousness. And then, of course, you would still have the possibility, well, is it one consciousness or is it many consciousness that give rise to reality? Kind of, do you believe in polytheism or in monotheism? And there, of course, if you look at the possibilities, especially if you compare the arguments, let's say from Aquinas, what would restrict such a being, and would it still be the ultimate cause of everything if this being would be contingent? Then it would need an explanation for itself. Then Richard Dawkins would have a point to ask, well, who created God? If God would be, or the creator, or the ultimate ground of being, however you call it, if this ground of being would be contingent, then it would require an explanation why it has this contingent reality rather than another. And then you need a more ultimate reality, a more deeper lying ground of being or godlike being. So that's the reason why I think that polytheism ultimately makes sense, because polytheism says that you have different kinds of beings that transcend space and time, but that are still contingent. One being has different properties than the others, and what is the explanation for their contingency? So you have to assume something beyond them that explains that. So ultimately, I think only monotheism really explains why there is anything rather than nothing, with this kind of necessary existing, having a necessary being at the ground of being, rather than an infinite chain of contingent beings. And there are philosophical reasons why an infinite chain of causes or of explanations couldn't work.
Yeah, so I guess that you arrived at theism mainly through metaphysical inquiry, and would that be, and looking at the arguments for classical theism and realizing that all of them are like the only ones, that the only arguments that really can account for the big questions about the universe and time and consciousness, right? Okay. Well,
Right, right.
yeah, of course.
That of course doesn't bring you to
Yeah.
Jesus and the Bible. So that is something that critics often say, well, but that doesn't prove your God. And of course it doesn't prove, but at
Mm-hmm.
least it shows that materialism and atheism is false. And that was also my path. I first became then
Mm-hmm.
convinced from a kind of generic theism, but was not yet settled for any particular religion. Because it could also be that only generic theism is true and that all religions are either totally false or partly right. It's not necessarily so that it's the only possible option that only one of the religions that we find on planet Earth is the correct religion. So I looked at the evidence, and there, of course, you need different evidence, not scientific evidence and not philosophical evidence and arguments from metaphysics, but historical evidence, because the different religions, especially the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, make very specific historical claims, and these claims you can test with standard secular historical methods and check what is the best explanation for the data that would be accepted by ordinary historians, even secular historians that don't believe.
Yeah, but I guess, like, before we move into the discussion about the specific religions, right? I guess I want to ask you, if you were to be if you were to decide, like, what degree of confidence do you have in terms of the metaphysical or the rational conclusion that you have arrived, that there is a theist God out there? Like, would you say you're sort of 100%, or are you simply that you're looking at the data set and this is the best answer that we could have?
I would say it's an inference to the best explanation. It can never be 100%. I would say I'm almost 100% sure that materialism is false, because I think ultimately materialism is incoherent, and that means it's not just a probability question. It's not a Bayesian argument that materialism is false. I think it is incoherent. It is logically false. So I think I'm 100% or 99.99999% sure that materialism is false. I would say that I'm more than 90% sure that either this Aristotelian view or this Neoplatonist view is correct. Not 100%, but very sure. If it comes to more specific things, or which we may discuss later or not, however you prefer, then my confidence level would be much lower. So I would say I believe that Christianity is true higher than 50%, but not so much higher. So maybe it's 60% that I would give confidence to Christianity. It wouldn't need too much conflicting evidence to make me give up on Christianity and accept something else. So it's not that I would say the confidence level is equal as the confidence level that materialism is wrong, or that some kind of
but from what you said earlier, right? Like, in I guess you believe in theism first, and then the Christianity follows.
Definitely this kind of chain. First, you have to see that materialism is wrong. Then you find that theism is the best explanation. Then you look in the evidence for different religions and may or may not decide for one of those religions that resonate with theism. So
well, let's talk about the best explanation thing, though, right? Like, just because something is the best explanation doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one, or doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
But
right?
Of course, if you look for explanations, you would always always accept the best explanation unless the evidence, even for this best explanation, is so spurious that you would give it a very, very low confidence level. So of course you can imagine cases where you have, let's say, the choice between 2 or 3 explanations that are all abysmal in empirical support, and one is a little bit better supported than the others. Then of course you wouldn't with very much confidence prefer one explanation over the other. So I would say you must have 2 things together. You must have more evidence for one explanation than all the others to make this inference to the best explanation, and it must be sufficient evidence to give you a relatively high confidence level that this is sufficient support to consider this explanation as correct. So in some sciences, you would have statistical tests to see what is the Bayesian posterior probability that this theory is rather true than false or something like this. So yes, I wouldn't believe in theism only because it's the best explanation if the supporting evidence wouldn't be so strong.
Okay, well, let's get down to the religion part, right? Okay, let's say that you have, I guess, proven that there's sufficient evidence to believe that there's that theism is true based on the metaphysical and some scientific arguments. So let's talk about how you become how you decided that Christianity is the right religion. Yeah.
So again, I wouldn't look at, let's say, religious arguments, Bible-based arguments first. I wouldn't throw the Bible out of the window. It's a historical document, but I would look for historical arguments based on historical documents, which can include the books of the Bible, but also can include sources outside of the Bible. And of course, also sources from other religions. Then compare what claims are made in the Quran about history, what claims are made in the Old Testament for Judaism, and what claims are made specifically in the New Testament, and what is the historical evidence. Can we say anything about these events? Can we have some confidence that some are true and others are definitely false? And when I first started to explore this, and I did this very reluctantly because let's say my prior view was it's all bullshit. The Bible is a book by Iron Age goat herders who had no clue how the world works and made up some fancy fantasy stories. So I had no inclination to look much into the Bible. I was also not very much interested in this stuff, but I looked at some of the arguments from classical apologists, evidential apologists who present the evidence, let's say, for the historicity of the resurrection. And I thought probably it's all very spurious, very weak arguments, and the whole thing collapses as soon as you use some more rigorous standards of critical exploration of the data. But I found that the evidence is relatively strong. It's not as strong as the evidence in the topics that we discussed before, but it's still so that I would say there are clearly historical claims. If you distinguish, let's say, the Quran and the Bible or the New Testament, and the Quran says that Jesus didn't die after the crucifixion, and the New Testament says that he did die prior to the resurrection. And you look at secular historians, what they say, people who don't believe in Christianity, who don't believe in God, and who don't believe that the Bible is divinely inspired or something, but look at this just from a kind of ancient Near East history point of view, then there is clearly a not only a vast majority, but an avalanche of experts are all agreeing that certainly Jesus did die with the crucifixion and nobody survived this, and there's no evidence that this was a kind of stunt or hoax or that there was a twin brother or anything like this. In the Quran, I think it's written, it was made so that it appears to them as if Jesus died on the cross. But the historical evidence tells otherwise. And if we look at all these different arguments, the arguments for the claims of Jesus, what can we say, what he really said and what he really thought, the evidence from the early history of the church, how can it be explained that let's say enemies and doubters of early Christianity then became convinced that it's true after having these alleged experiences of seeing the risen Christ. And so if we take all this together and we look just for the best explanation and explore all these alternative naturalistic explanations, the swoon theory that this was a kind of hoax, or that the disciples stole the body, or that it was a mass hallucination, or that they all suffered from cognitive dissonance and made up some consoling story to explain why their savior was crucified like a gangster. So if we look at all these other explanations, we find that they can't ultimately explain all the universally accepted historical facts, so not the controversial claims, the miracle claims that Jesus walked on water or something, but the claims that are agreed even by the secular historians. So facts like the early origin of Christianity and the conversion of Paul, who was a enemy of early Christian, the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, who was a doubter according to the New Testament, and the empty tomb, which is affirmed indirectly by Jewish sources, which say that they explain this whole thing with that the disciples stole the body, or somebody stole the body, which indirectly is affirming that there was an empty tomb. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to make up the story to explain how the body disappeared. And that we find something like this in early Jewish sources is an independent confirmation that this story of the empty tomb is true and is a historical fact that requires explanation. And if all these facts are taken together, then I think the best explanation is indeed that the resurrection is historical. But you can, of course, only make this inference if you have a prior belief in theism, because if you're an atheist and a naturalist, then the prior probability for a miracle like a resurrection is zero. And then whatever evidence you bring cannot turn a prior probability of zero into anything above zero. But if you believe that that theism is true, that there is a God who created the universe, then resurrection in a way is child's play compared to the creation of the space-time universe. And then, of course, you at least have the possibility to accept this explanation if it is the best explanation of the evidence. And what I found to my surprise is that indeed the evidence for the historicity of the resurrection is the best explanation. And that is the main reason why I believe that Christianity is true. One other reason, which was even more surprising for me, because I totally believe that biblical prophecy is nonsense and not different from modern prophecies or Nostradamus, who make this kind of vague claims that then are fulfilled anyway by something. Claims like next year something bad will happen on planet Earth. Of course, something bad will happen. So it's not surprising that prophecies like this are fulfilled. But there are very specific prophecies in the Bible that are fulfilled in the New Testament, which are quite stunning, quite surprising. And a third point that convinced me after I had this evidence, this historical evidence, is the coherence of this whole book, because of course the Bible is not one book, it's a amalgam of many books by many authors written over a long period of time. But if you look at the whole story, you have a kind of interaction where certain things in the New Testament explain certain facts in the Old Testament and vice versa, or different books in the New Testament explain each other, and they are often so minor details that it doesn't look like somebody made this up, like Harry Potter Part 7 explains something in Harry Potter Part 3, or but that there are things that are called by an American apologist undesigned coincidences, that there are total side issues in a story that appear totally irrelevant, that are unexplained, let's say, in one gospel, and then you have some minor information in another gospel that suddenly explain why this is so and not other. And this kind of interlocking between the New Testament and the Old Testament, and between the different books and the whole coherence of the story, is something that would be possible if you have the modern technology available, let's say, of a computer, and you can design a book, and you have all these copy paste search abilities to make this text so coherent. But it would be, I think, very hard to explain considering the history of the Bible and the many different authors over centuries, to explain this coherence and interlocking of the different books. So these three facts, the historical evidence, the evidence from prophecy, and the coherence of the Bible, these are the arguments that then convinced me that Christianity is true and not Judaism and Islam. Or not Judaism is not totally correct, because of course Christianity, which is something that Jews of course would refuse, but Christianity in a way is just extended Judaism. So it's claiming that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, which modern Jews don't believe. But it's not a totally different religion. It's a kind of Judaism plus.
Yeah, I really think that this is really interesting, because basically you're centering your belief in Christianity on Christ's resurrection and the Bible's, I guess, cross-referencing miraculous coherence, right? And
Yes.
okay, let's talk about your because you're a paleontologist, right, and an anti-Darwinist, and
Right.
this is something that I really
Totally
wanted to
different
dive
story.
into. But now that we're talking about the Bible, right, I want to know your views on Genesis, and then
Okay, yeah.
maybe you could trickle down and talk about everything.
Yes. So generally, I think it is very, very, very unfortunate that this whole issue of interpreting Genesis has been kind of captured in the past 100 years by a group of fundamentalist evangelical Christians who think that a simplistic, literalistic understanding of Genesis is the only possible correct explanation, and who believe that the universe and Earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days, and that there was a universal global flood, and that there was really this floating zoo where all the species or kinds of animals were preserved on this floating boat by Noah. I think this is totally false, total nonsense, totally not recognizing the real message of Genesis. And I think that that the message of Genesis is much more subtle, and I more agree with, let's say, more sophisticated interpreters of this book, like John Walton, who say, if we look at certain patterns in this book on the structure, how these verses are made, then we find that there are patterns that strongly suggest that this is not meant literally, but that there are certain messages that the authors, and there's a dual authorship, of course, if you're a believing Christian, of course, only, otherwise it's only authorship by humans, but Christians believe that there's a dual authorship. It was written by humans in a certain historical context in their language, but it was also inspired by God. So there is this kind of dual divine human authorship of the Bible. And I very much like this view that was promoted by a quite liberal American theologian, Peter Enns, which is the incarnational view of scripture, that like Jesus was totally divine and fully human. Also scripture is fully divine, but also fully human. And we have to look very closely which parts are the fully human parts of scripture, including the limitations of the time, and what is the subtle divine message of scripture. So I think that it's not an accident that we find all these similarities, let's say, between a temple inauguration, which was very elaborately discussed by John Walton in his books, and Genesis 1. I think that it's not an accident that if we look at when Adam and Eve are thrown out of the paradise, that they are going east of Eden, like the Jewish people went east when they went into the exile to Babylon. I think that Genesis is more an allegorical story telling the history of Israel, of the chosen people, explaining this covenant that God is making with the Israelites, with the Hebrews, and ultimately will bring forth the Messiah from these people. And if we look, let's say, just to give one example of something that in Catholic theology is called typology, not only in Catholic theology, but especially in Catholic theology, called typology, which is that you find certain events in the Old Testament that parallel or foreshadow events in the New Testament. And if we look, for example, at the Ark story, and we don't use the simplistic understanding that it was a floating zoo preserving the ecosystem of this time from a global flood. But look, why does the Ark have only one door? And the Ark saves the only people that were saved, the righteous people that were saved in the Ark, and they went through this door, and the innocent animals that were saved were passing through this single door. And in the New Testament, we find Jesus not for nothing saying, I am the door, and I am the only way to salvation. So you have this foreshadowing in this whole Ark story, the Ark in a way a type for the church, for the saving condition or saving purpose of the church, and the single door that leads to salvation is Jesus. And so I think these are subtle messages of the story that are the real messages, and not that we have to read this like a science textbook or history textbook, that it really happened. And therefore, I think questions like how long were the days of creation, or did the sun really stand still at this day of war of Joshua, are totally beside the point, and totally not recognizing the real story, the grand story of the Bible, which is the story of covenant, starting with a covenant between the first humans, the first people, Adam and Eve, and then the covenant with a family, of Noah and his sons and his wife, and then the covenant of God was extended to a people, Abraham and his descendants, and then with the kingdom, with the Davidic kingdom and the Davidic covenant, and then the ultimate Davidic kingdom with Jesus, which is a universal kingdom and a universal covenant of God with all humans. And I think this is the overall story that is told by the Bible, and is a grand story, and not a petty story of let's say, natural history in language of Iron Age or Bronze Age people. Clearly, the Bible didn't teach new science to ancient people, and that was not God's purpose. And even Galileo said it very well: the Bible teach how to go to heaven and not how the heavens go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess when it comes to the natural history, though, how would you put like creation? Are you looking at like a old Earth creation or a young Earth one?
No, of course I'm an old Earth proponent, so I have no doubt that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and that Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and all the datings of the fossils, I think there is overwhelming evidence for an old Earth and for an old universe. But also, if we look at common ancestry, I think that this whole debate among modern creationists, which give the impression that there is a kind of exclusive, either you believe in common ancestry or you believe in creation, if these are giving the impression that these are mutual exclusive hypothesis, and I don't think so. I think I believe in common ancestry in a way. I think that not someday in the Cretaceous birds popped up on a lake where no birds were before, and suddenly ducks came into existence out of nothing. Even the Bible doesn't say that animals and plants were created ex nihilo. It's clearly saying, let the earth bring forth, and it's not specified how the earth brings forth new organisms. So I think the process of common ancestry is not the crucial question. The crucial question is, how does new information that transforms one life form into the other, how is this information coming about? Is it coming about by a slow, totally natural, totally unguided process of chance and necessity, or can it only be explained by punctual events of infusion of new information into space-time? And I think the evidence clearly speaks towards the latter hypothesis. And then, of course, this distinction between common ancestry and special creation becomes very fuzzy, because at which point God isn't limited to create new organisms from the dust of the earth. He can use whatever matter he wants, and it could also be living matter. So he could create in the womb of a maternal organism by infusing new information into the system, like Jesus was in a way not created. Of course, Jesus pre-existed as the third person of the Trinity, but his body was created in the womb of Mary in a miraculous way, but still he had a human mother. And I think this could also be the case in Earth history, that you have this chain of common ancestry, but still the new information was not introduced by just a hereditary process of copy errors of the genetic system, but was introduced from outside the system. And I don't even necessarily think that this must have been God with direct miraculous interventions. It could be a more indirect process of, especially if you are Neoplatonist and you believe that templates and forms exist, let's say, in the mind of God as eternal templates and as kind of attractors, that this kind of information templates are downloaded into space-time by processes that could be explained by certain processes of quantum biology, where parts of DNA of the genome are entangled. And in the state of entanglement, when they collapse into mutations, into concrete states, then if you look at the wave function, of course, those states that have an adaptive advantage would populate more branches of the quantum wave function than non-adaptive mutations. And so they could be more frequent. And so you could have non-random teleological mutations. You would have a development that is, of course, ultimately divinely guided, because you need this kind of structure of the wave function and of Hilbert space to have this process going into a certain, it would not be necessarily that God decides, oh, let's make a bacterial flagellum or something like this. I think this would be also a little bit too simplistic and would create also problems of evil. So why are certain evil systems intelligently designed in nature? And I think this could be more easily explained with such processes of downloading of information in a way from the cloud.
So basically what you're saying is like, it's not that God directly interferes with the process of evolution, but that the universe as this integrated sort of system, it sort of has a like an automatic way or way.
Yes and no. I think the crucial point here is that for me it doesn't make any sense to say that God intervenes, let's say, as a cause in nature, because God is outside of space and time and he is orchestrating this whole mechanism in an atemporal way. So I think it is directly influenced by God with this purpose in mind, and it is intelligently designed in a purposeful planning way. But this design process is rather done on the level of a fine-tuned structure of Hilbert space. And I have currently, I'm busy developing a theory of this kind of quantum evolution, quantum intelligent design with a colleague in America. And I think that Hilbert space in quantum mechanics and the so-called fitness landscape, the fitness space in evolutionary biology, are actually the same thing, and that there is a fine-tuning of this fitness landscape of the Hilbert space part that is responsible for biological evolution. And this fine-tuning and structuring of this mathematical space, that is certainly in the mind of God, and everything, I think, is happening either in the mind of God or emergent from the mind of God.
But I can't really see the difference between just natural evolution and
yes,
what.
there's definitely a difference if you have a process that has no goal in mind and that would just run automatically if God exists or not. So Darwinian evolution, those people who are theistic evolutionists, they think that Darwinian evolution is true, but they also believe in God. But if theism would be false and Christianity would be false, then Darwinian evolution, according to them, would still work. God is not a crucial part of this whole process. In my view, this is totally wrong. I think that certain phenomena, if we look at the history of life, and especially the discontinuities in the fossil record, this clearly shows that this cannot be explained with a naturalistic process of mere chance, copy errors, and natural or sexual selection, because this requires a gradual process with tiny steps, as Richard Dawkins said it, with this metaphor of climbing Mountain Improbable. You cannot jump a steep cliff, but on the backside of the mountain, there is a gentle slope with small steps, and step by step, you can climb the mountain from the backside. And that's the way how evolution works. But jumping the cliff would be a miracle. But what the fossil record shows is that the history of life was a history of jumping cliffs, of very quick transformations, of sudden appearances of new body plans. And this cannot be explained with such a mechanistic natural process that is unguided. And it doesn't make a difference if this guiding is an intervention in space-time by an agent that lives in space-time. And there are many modern Christian theists who have this kind of neo-theist understanding that God, even if he maybe was outside of time before creation, now is inside of time and acts inside of time like a superhuman agent, like a superhuman genetic engineer intervening in space-time, and like a gardener looking at planet Earth and planting stuff here and there. And but the difference, to my view, which is that God is outside of space and time and is orchestrating this process by structuring this mathematical space that is also outside of space and time, but that is then giving rise to space-time. That is still not a naturalistic process, and is clearly a goal-directed process that has information put inside of it, has an end goal, has particular information, specified information infused at certain points in space-time. It's just, I would say it's a matter of taste if you prefer to see this as the infusion is done within space-time or it is done outside of space-time, but there is definitely information coming from outside of the system.
Mm-hmm. So if I were to put it plainly, like I would say what you just said is that atheistic evolution is probabilistically impossible. There and now you're if we add God into the equation, that it is possible.
That is in a way true. I would even say a little bit stronger. I think there is very strong evidence from mainstream science, even if you accept all the Darwinian let's say methods and paradigms, where we can show that the Darwinian process is simply mathematically not feasible. And that is something that I'm currently working on in a research project, is the so-called waiting time problem. And that is something when you use the standard methodological apparatus of population genetics, where you can do calculations of how are genes originating and propagating in populations. And you look at the fossil record and the available windows of time for certain transitions. What you find then is, let's say for a transition from a land-living quadrupedal terrestrial ancestor of whales that looked like a pig to a fully marine whales that looked like a dolphin. And there is maybe a window of time available for this transformation of 4 million years, which is, by the way, just the lifespan of a single larger vertebrate species to make this reconstruction, this re-engineering. But if we look at population genetics, we see there are certain, to make this transition and this large re-engineering from a land animal to an aquatic animal, you need a lot of new genes, of new organs to allow for this transformation. And these genes have to come into being in an ancestral population. They have to occur, the proper mutations, and they have to spread. It's not enough that one mutation occurs in some animal within a population, but if you want to transform the whole lineage, the whole species, this mutation has to spread in the population. That is called fixation time in population genetics. And you have a whole mathematical apparatus how you can model this, and you can do the math, you can do the calculations. We have all the data that are necessary for this. We know the mutation rates, we know the general, let's say, realm of possible values for the population sizes, that an ancestral whale population couldn't have had the size of, let's say, a bacterial population. So we can make reasonable estimates of all these necessary values: population size, generation turnover time, mutation rate, and so on. And if we do the math, what we consistently find is that the required time from even make simple transformations would be 10 times longer than the geologically available times. And this shows that there is something wrong with this process. It simply cannot do what it is supposed to do in the available time. And therefore, I would say, again, like in the case of theism, it's as you said, a probabilistic argument. It's an inference to the best explanation. But the best explanation, because we know it's not an inference from, let's say, a God of the gaps argument, what many critics say, that this is a God of the gaps argument and an argument from ignorance. We simply don't understand how it worked, and therefore we say God did it. But that's nonsense. It's an argument from what we do know. We do know that specified information is only coming about in any instance that we have ever observed by mental activity and by the causal activity of an intelligent mind, and that books don't write themselves, and software codes don't write themselves, and you cannot transform Mac OS 10 into Windows 10 by simply changing random bits and selecting the working outcomes. The only thing you will get is a broken code after some random changes of bits. That is what happens in functional information when you deteriorate the code. And so I think it's an inference to the best explanation from what we do know about the causal structure of the universe, what we do know from uniform observation, and is therefore a positive argument, a positive inference to the best argument explanation, or as it is also called, an abductive argument. And I think the case is getting stronger and stronger the more we know. And it's not just like it's some crazy creationists or Darwin critics that say this. there's a growing consensus among theoretical biologists. And with this, I mean those few biologists and evolutionary biologists that really work on the theory. 99% of biologists work on some detailed problems and are specialized and don't really think about the theory of evolution. They learned this on university and they apply what they learned and they solve their detailed everyday problem and make their papers. But there is a small group of theoretical biologists who really think about the theory of evolution. And there's a general growing consensus among them. It's not for nothing that we have this whole movement of the extended synthesis that is saying neo-Darwinism, which is just another word for the modern synthesis or this process of random mutation, natural selection, fails to explain the crucial phenomena of how do new organs come about, how do new information originates, how can these non-gradual transitions in the fossil record be explained. This is acknowledged by prominent evolutionary biologists like for example, Professor Gerd Müller from Austria or Eva Jablonka, or you name it. There are dozens and dozens of specialists who now acknowledge neo-Darwinism has failed, and now they look for different alternatives. And there are a lot of catchwords now discussed, like evo-devo and phenotypic plasticity and niche construction and natural genetic engineering. But none of these approaches has either even attempted to solve the problem, how does new information arise, or they ultimately have to rely on neo-Darwinism to explain how these processes came into being. So I think it will only be a question of maybe 10 more years when all these approaches have failed as well, that there will be a rethinking in biology and a growing acceptance for a paradigm change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've gotten, I guess, like more than an hour, bro. But I want to ask you about the techno-utopian view that you have, if you allow me to ask.
Yes, sure.
A big okay, well, I guess like we have established what your ontological views on universe is, that it's a sort of neo Platonist idealism, and you've proven yourself to be a proper classical theist and a Christian, and being able to explain why you're an anti-Darwinist. But I
Right.
want to know, I guess, when we look into the future in terms of ethics and politics and basically your views on morality, I guess, what are the conclusions from all of your views that lead you to how we humans should behave, both yeah.
I think it has, if you want to especially focus on this question of morality and politics, I think there are two main points. So as you said, I'm a techno-utopian. This means I ultimately believe that we have the brains to further develop technology, to solve certain problems, that we will not be doomed, that there will not be the end of the world with climate change, that these are problems that can be solved, or that we can successfully adapt to certain changes. But of course, every technology brings certain risks and certain considerations. And I think there are two major issues related to morality. So one is, I think, where morality is misguided in let's say, hampering these processes, is the morality as it is used by, let's say, the dominating left-leaning group of environmentalists who think the best we can do to stop global warming is to return all the world should become organic farmers, and we should stop the whole project of civilization and return to huts and grow cabbage in the backyard and stop to emit any kind of carbon. I think this is total nonsense, and this would lead to a catastrophe, because the world ecosystem with the current population could never support this degree of organic farming. Organic farming usually uses 10 or 100 times more land than more sophisticated ways of agriculture. So I think there, or also if we look at medicine, where people who have this view, nature is better and we shouldn't use genetic engineering, is really prohibiting development of crops that could grow, especially under changing climate in tropical zones, and could prohibit starvation of hundreds of millions of people. I think this should not be stopped because of stupid morality and saying nature is the perfect way and we shouldn't change the course of nature, or we shouldn't interfere with creation. That is also not the Christian view. The Christian view is to have this kind of stewardship of creation and to not destroy nature, but to use it for human flourishing. But on the other hand, of course, there are developments where moral concerns are justified. These are issues, for example, when it comes to, should we really totally fuse with machines? Where is the limit? What we should do in terms of endangering the dignity of the human being, and is there a risk that we will ultimately turn into the Borg, like in Star Trek, where we are all robots and so fused with technology that we are no longer human? And are there dangers by artificial intelligence that this could, in a way, develop into this kind of Terminator scenario where artificial intelligence could be an existential risk for humanity? I don't think so. I rather think that these problems are over-dramatized, and artificial intelligence will be a beneficial development for humanity. But of course, it has to be used in a good way for human benefit. And I think there Christianity really has to say something to the whole discussion, because we have to develop this technology with the dignity of the human being in mind and not treat humans like they are just another piece of carbon-based technology that can be used for any kind of transformation, and where it doesn't make a big difference if we generate a mechanical iron-made robot or transform some biological being into some kind of hybrid between machine and human. I think there the Christian ethical view of human dignity is crucial to preserve a world that is really worth living and that is not turning into a kind of dystopian nightmare. But generally, I think modern technology is beneficial. There is a wrong skepticism among many people today that reject modern technology as if it would be some kind of evil force, and therefore you have now all these doubters that think that vaccinations against COVID are evil and are a means by which Bill Gates want to infuse chips into humans and all this kind of bullshit. I think all these developments of medicine and of technology have improved human livings. We live better now than our forefathers lived 100 years ago. Where I do some, as hobby, I do some research, ancestry research on my personal ancestry. And if you look how your ancestors 100 or 200 or 300 years ago lived, and you look at the lists of their children, and you see they died, half of their children died, and the women died with 25 or 30 after they have given birth to their 10th child, and the life expectancy was maybe 45 or something. Then we see how much beneficial modern technology and medicine has been, and I think this can further expand, but it has to be done wisely to develop a more modern but also more humane modern society. And therefore I think it would be very bad if Christianity would disappear, because it's an important player in this discussion of ideas and of moral values, that otherwise there are no really human rights without a transcendent source for them. And if atheism and materialism would be true, why should we treat humans other than any other piece of matter? It's just a complex arrangement of carbon atoms and other substances. So it's not really, you can of course have moral views, but there is no reason why you should have these kind of moral views without a transcendent standard of morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess like well, if this is the case in terms of your views on the politics and how society should work, and that Christianity is sort of the stronghold and protector of human dignity and like an objective basis for our values, right? Can you, I guess, like talk about simply what the existential answer is to the big question of what is the meaning of life? I guess you have to talk about in terms of Christianity, but in layman's terms, what would be the purpose why we are here?
So the you can contrast it very easily. The secular view of the meaning of life would be self-fulfillment. So just enjoy life as long and as pleasurable as possible. And when you're dead, this is it, and that was your life, and then it's over. The Christian view, of course, would be that your life has a higher purpose, and that the ultimate purpose of life is to live forever together with God and to recognize God, not just because he is the creator and a kind of celestial dictator, like Christopher Hitchens called it, and he was afraid that if heaven would be existing, then it would be kind of celestial North Korea. That of course is nonsense. If God exists, then he's the ultimate good and the thing that we should long for, the being we should long for. And the special point of Christianity is that God is not just some kind of remote being that is remote from human affairs, but is a God that entered space-time and entered the human condition and wants to share eternity with us in a kind of family relationship, to have this kind of eternal family relationship with God. And I think this is the ultimate purpose of human life.
And one last question, because this is sort of you could tell it from your own subjective experience, but I guess you're a Christian, right? And would you describe your, I guess, relationship with Christ or God as sort of a relationship that is loving and intimate? And do you actually experience this on a daily basis? How would
no? Yeah, interesting question that I get surprisingly often, and that is the only thing where I think that my upbringing and my 40 years of being an atheist really have maybe hampered my spiritual further development. I do not really have this kind of, like many people honestly tell me that they have this kind of personal relationship, that they have this kind of reciprocal dialogue with God, or I don't have this. So when I pray, I don't really have this feeling that I'm talking to a friend who is responding to me. I have the intellectual understanding and the intellectual view that God is really there and that he listens, but I don't have a personal relationship really in a deep emotional sense. I really approach this from a very intellectual point of view, and I fear that is something that is not giving to my personality and also hampered by my personal history. So I'm not one of those who would be very into charismatic Christianity and dancing and singing and hallelujah and Jesus loves me. And that's not my cup of tea, even though I really am jealous on people who also have this kind of spiritual experiences, even if they are more abstract experiences like this oneness with the universe, or I never had something like this.
Yeah, I guess I would just say Günter, God works in mysterious ways. So maybe you do have.
That's what I hope.
Maybe you do have this special relationship with him that it doesn't have to be what mainstream Christians like this charismatic Christians experience. So, and man, hey man, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You are so intelligent, and I hope that I could talk like you someday and have that knowledge enough to share to the world, and be able to express my worldview as comprehensive and detailed as you. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. So take care.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in, and please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
The skills and credentials you need for the career you want are within reach at University of Maryland Global Campus. An accredited state university, UMGC offers online courses, personalized advising, lifetime career services, and more. Visit umgc.edu/podcast.